Who'd have thought the quiet widow with weathered hands and gentle eyes could bring the most feared outlaw gang in the territory to their knees? What they didn't realize was that beneath her unassuming appearance lay the brilliant mind of a master trapper whose ingenious snares and hunting systems were once commissioned by military scouts and wilderness expeditions across the frontier. They made their biggest mistake when they torched her barn. Not knowing every ridge, ravine, and forest path of her valley was rigged with an intricate network of deadfalls, pit traps, and tripwires that could transform the entire landscape into a weapon with the simple pull of a hidden lever. By the time they realized who they were dealing with, it was already too late. The hunters had become the hunted. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Valley, painting golden streaks across Margaret Maggie Thorne's sprawling homestead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 45, Maggie moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime surviving the harsh realities of frontier life. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was tied back in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades as she made her way across the yard toward the barn that stood as the centerpiece of her property. The sturdy timber structure dominated the farmyard, its weathered planks bearing silent witness to 20 years of harsh winters and scorching summers. Unlike the hastily constructed shelters that dotted neighboring properties, Maggie's barn was a testament to careful craftsmanship, with ingenious support systems and hidden compartments that made it as much a fortress as a place to house livestock and store grain. The sight of it always brought a bittersweet smile to her face, a reminder of Daniel, her late husband, and the life they had built together before the fever took him 4 winters past. "Another day begins, old friend," she murmured to the barn, running her hand along the smooth wooden beam beside the entrance. "Let's see what it brings us." Maggie knelt beside a small trapdoor near the foundation, pulling a worn leather pouch from inside her jacket. With practiced movements, she opened the concealed compartment and checked the tension on the thin wires that ran beneath the floorboards, adjusting one that had loosened slightly during the night. Satisfied with the calibration, she made a few notes in the small journal she always carried. Most folks in Coopersville, the nearest town, believed Maggie was simply a widow struggling to maintain her late husband's property. They pitied her, this woman alone on 500 acres with nothing but livestock and the occasional hired hand for company. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Margaret Thorne had designed every inch of the defensive systems that protected not only her homestead, but much of the surrounding valley. Before marrying Daniel and settling in Willow Creek Valley, Maggie had been Margaret Walsh, one of the most skilled trappers and survival experts in the Western Territories. Her designs had transformed vulnerable outposts into secure havens from the Dakota Territory to the Colorado mountains. The intricate system of snares, tripwires, pitfalls, and alarm mechanisms that ran throughout her property was her masterpiece, a project she and Daniel had worked on together until his passing. "Morning, Mrs. Thorne," called a cheerful voice, pulling Maggie from her thoughts. Turning, she spotted young Caleb Foster, the 17-year-old son of her closest neighbors, riding up on his dappled mare. Caleb worked part-time at the homestead, helping with the heavier chores, too demanding for Maggie to handle alone. "Morning, Caleb," she replied, closing and securing the trapdoor before standing. "You're here early today." Caleb dismounted, his freckled face bright with excitement beneath his mop of sandy hair. "Pa said the Blackwell brothers are driving their cattle through the North Valley today. Thought you might want some extra hands if they cut across your property again." Maggie nodded, brushing dust from her worn canvas trousers. "That's thoughtful. Of you both. I was just about to check the ridgeline traps. You can ride with me." As they walked toward the stable, Maggie pointed out a section of fencing that needed mending and asked Caleb about his younger siblings. Their conversation was easy, familiar, the kind that developed from years of shared work and mutual respect. Inside the stable, Maggie saddled her horse, a steady chestnut gelding named Cooper. The morning routine was comforting in its predictability. Check the barn mechanisms, tend to the animals, inspect the trap systems, and review the day's work with whoever was helping out. Since Daniel's death, these rhythms had kept her grounded, given structure to days that might otherwise have been swallowed by grief. "So, how are things in town?" Maggie asked as they rode out, following the path that wound through stands of aspen toward the northern ridge of the property. Caleb shrugged. "Same as always, I guess, though Mrs. Miller at the general store mentioned some strangers asking questions about the homesteads in the area, said they claimed to be cattle buyers." Maggie's expression remained neutral, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Cattle buyers? Did she say what kind of stock they were looking to purchase? Not particularly, just asking which properties had the most valuable herds and buildings. Caleb glanced at her. Mrs. Miller didn't trust them much, said they had the look of men who take more than they give. Maggie nodded, filing the information. Away! Cattle rustling had become increasingly common as lawless elements pushed into previously peaceful territories. Her property, with its substantial herd and well-built structures, had attracted unwanted attention before. As they crested a small rise, the northern ridge trapline came into view, a carefully constructed series of hidden snares and tripwires that to most eyes would appear as nothing more than natural features of the landscape. Maggie dismounted, handing Cooper's reins to Caleb while she inspected the mechanisms. What looked like ordinary rock formations and fallen logs to most observers was actually part of an elaborate system that Maggie could control from various points across the property. Hidden triggers could activate snares, release deadfalls, or even completely seal off certain areas if necessary. It was a system designed not only for hunting game, but with security in mind, a precaution from years of seeing how frontier isolation could attract those with predatory intentions. "Everything looks good here," she announced, returning to her horse. "Let's check the western approach before heading back. I want to make sure the warning system is intact for when the Blackwells pass through." They rode in companionable silence, crossing meadows where Maggie's small herd of cattle grazed contentedly. The homestead wasn't the largest in the territory, but it was among the most productive, another fact that puzzled neighbors who didn't understand how a widow with minimal help managed such efficiency. "Mrs. Thorne," Caleb began hesitantly as they approached the western sector of the property. "Ma was wondering if you'd consider joining us for supper this Sunday. She's been worried about you being out here alone so much." Maggie smiled, touched by the Fosters' continued concern. "That's kind of Sarah. Tell her I'd be delighted to come." The Foster family had been her closest friends even before Daniel's passing. Jacob Foster and his wife Sarah had stood by her during the darkest days after the illness claimed her husband, bringing food, helping with chores, and simply sitting with her when the silence of the cabin became too heavy to bear alone. "She'll be pleased to hear it," Caleb grinned. "Last time you came, Pa couldn't stop talking about your suggestions for improving their livestock pen. Said the new design keeps the wolves out better than anything he's tried before." Maggie shrugged, modestly. "Just a simple adjustment to the fencing pattern, nothing special." This was her way, downplaying her extensive knowledge of defensive systems, presenting her suggestions as practical frontier wisdom rather than the calculated designs of an expert. Over the years, she'd helped many neighboring homesteads improve their security, always careful to make her innovations seem like common sense rather than specialized expertise. They reached the western boundary, where a natural formation of rocks created a narrow passage that any approaching riders would need to traverse. Maggie dismounted again, kneeling to check the hidden warning system. a series of carefully balanced stones that would shift and release a small avalanche if disturbed by anyone who didn't know the safe path through. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Caleb, would you mind riding along the south line? Make sure there's no sign of trespassers. I'll check the main triggers here. The boy nodded and rode off, leaving Maggie alone with the gentle sounds of the wilderness around her. She moved to a nondescript oak tree at the edge of the clearing, using a small key from her pocket to unlock a hollow compartment disguised in its trunk. Inside was a triggering mechanism connected to an underground network of wires that could instantly activate traps across the entire western section of the property. Maggie checked the mechanism carefully, ensuring it moved smoothly. These hidden controls were positioned strategically throughout her land, her insurance against rustlers, bandits, and other threats. Few people knew about them. Even Caleb and his family had only a vague understanding of how extensively she had modified the natural features of the valley. Satisfied with her inspection, Maggie locked the compartment and walked back to where Cooper waited patiently. In the distance, she could see Caleb returning along the property line, waving to indicate all was clear. "Everything looks good, Mrs. Thorne," he reported as he reached her, "though I noticed some fresh hoof prints by the creek crossing. Might be the Blackwell cattle got through early." Maggie nodded. "We'll check the southern traps tomorrow. For now, let's head back. I need to prepare for my supply run to town." As they rode back toward the main homestead, the barn came into view. Again, its solid presence a constant in a changing landscape. Beyond it stood the modest two-story cabin where Maggie had lived for nearly 2 decades, its wide porch wrapping around 2 sides, Daniel's addition during their 5th anniversary year. The house looked simple from the outside, but like everything on Maggie's property, appearances were deceiving. The root cellar contained a workshop filled with trap designs, specialized tools, and models of defensive systems. The cabinets in her parlor concealed maps marked with trap locations and trigger points. Even the kitchen had been modified with a series of levers hidden beneath floorboards that could activate distant alarms in various configurations. "Will you need anything else today, Mrs. Thorne?" Caleb asked as they reached the stable and dismounted. Maggie shook her head. "Not today, thank you. I'll see you tomorrow morning. We'll check that creek crossing first thing." After Caleb left, Maggie led Cooper into the stable, removing his saddle and taking the time to brush him thoroughly. The quiet, repetitive motion was soothing, another ritual that helped order her days. "Just you and me this afternoon, boy," she murmured to the horse. "Need to go to town and see if I can learn more about these cattle buyers Caleb mentioned." Once Cooper was settled, Maggie made her way to the house, climbing the porch steps with a slight favor to her left leg. An old injury from a trap gone wrong years ago still bothered her during weather changes. Inside, the house was cool and quiet, filled with memories of the life she and Daniel had shared. She moved to her bedroom to change for the trip to town, exchanging her work clothes for a simple dress that would attract less attention. Maggie had learned long ago that people underestimated women in dresses, a fact she had used to her advantage many times in her trapping days, when clients or competitors dismissed her expertise based on her gender. At her dressing table she paused, looking at the photograph of Daniel that stood in a wooden frame, a strong-faced man with kind eyes and a slight smile, taken on their 10th anniversary. Beside it lay his pocket knife, the one possession of his she carried everywhere. "Another day keeping our home safe," she said softly to the image. "Though I'm a bit concerned about these strangers asking questions. Reminds me of that situation in the Dakota Territory." The situation in Dakota had been one of their last projects together, a series of raids that turned ugly when a gang tried to take over an entire settlement. Maggie and Daniel had designed a defensive system that protected the community and ultimately exposed the gang's hideout. The victory had made them some powerful enemies. Maggie tucked the knife into her pocket and headed downstairs. In the kitchen, she prepared a quick lunch, eating at the small table overlooking the back garden, where her herbs and vegetables grew in orderly rows. Through the window, she could see the barn standing solid and dependable, housing not just livestock and supplies, but many of the control mechanisms for the property's defenses. The barn was Daniel's legacy as much as hers. He had been a carpenter by trade, but had quickly learned the principles of trap-making to help bring her designs to life. Together, they had transformed this once vulnerable homestead into a fortress disguised as a simple farm. After lunch, Maggie hitched her wagon and set off for Coopersville. The 8-mile journey gave her time to think, to plan, to consider the implications of strangers asking about local properties. Willow Creek Valley had been relatively peaceful compared to other territories where livestock theft and homestead raids had become common. She hoped it would stay that way. Coopersville came into view as Maggie rounded the final bend in the road, a small but growing town of about 300 souls. Main Street consisted of the essential businesses: Miller's General Store, the Coopersville Bank, Harrington's Blacksmith, the Silver Spur Saloon, and a handful of other establishments serving the surrounding farming and ranching community. Maggie guided her wagon to the hitching post outside the general store, nodding greetings to familiar faces as she stepped down. Inside, the bell above the door announced her arrival, and Harriet Miller looked up from behind the counter, her round face breaking into a warm smile. "Maggie Thorne, just the woman I was hoping to see today," Harriet exclaimed, coming around to embrace her. "How are you holding up out there?" "Just fine, Harriet," Maggie replied with a smile. "Caleb mentioned something about strangers asking questions. Thought I might hear a bit more about that." Harriet's expression grew serious as she glanced around the store to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Yes, 3 men came through earlier this week. City types, despite their attempts to dress like ranchers. Asked all sorts of questions about livestock, property values, especially about the homesteads that seemed most prosperous." She gave Maggie a meaningful look. "Your place came up more than once." Maggie's face remained composed, though her mind was already calculating possibilities, threats, contingencies. "Did they give names, say who they represented?" "Called themselves representatives of the Western Cattle Company," Harriet replied. "Left some fancy business cards, though I noticed the print seemed fresh, like they'd just had them made." She reached under the counter and passed a card to Maggie. Something felt off about them, especially the leader, tall fellow with a scar across his cheek, cold eyes. Kept asking which properties might be most vulnerable to, how did he put it, unexpected hardships. Seemed more interested in buildings and defenses than actual cattle. Maggie examined the card. Western Cattle Company was printed in elaborate script, but the paper was cheap and the ink slightly smudged, the work of a small-town printer rather than an established business. She tucked it into her pocket alongside Daniel's knife. "Thanks for the warning, Harriet. Now, about my supply order." They moved on to business, Maggie purchasing the provisions she needed for the coming week. As Harriet tallied the items, Sheriff Nathan Grayson entered the store, his tall frame filling the doorway momentarily before he spotted Maggie and approached with a tip of his hat. "Mrs. Thorne, good to see you in town," he greeted her. "Everything quiet at your place?" Grayson had been a friend of Daniel's, and his concern for Maggie since her husband's death had been genuine, if sometimes a bit overprotective. "Peaceful as ever, Sheriff," she replied, "though I hear we've had some strangers asking questions about local properties." Grayson's expression darkened slightly. "Indeed we have. Can't say I took to them much. Asked too many questions and answered too few." He lowered his voice. "Between us, I telegraphed some contacts in Cheyenne about this Western Cattle Company. No record of them, but plenty of reports of similar operations scouting properties before." Raids, Maggie nodded unsurprised. I appreciate you looking into it, Nathan. Any idea if they're still around? Checked out of the boarding house yesterday, but mentioned they'd be returning soon with associates. Said they were very interested in the northern properties. Grayson's gaze was direct. Your property specifically? A cold certainty settled. In Maggie's stomach, she had feared as much. Well, if they come calling, I'll be sure to let you know. Grayson seemed about to say more when the door opened again, admitting Jacob Foster, Caleb's father. His normally cheerful face was etched with worry as he spotted Maggie and the sheriff. Maggie, Nathan, he greeted them breathlessly. Glad I caught you both. Just rode in from the North Ridge. Saw a group of riders heading toward the county line. 6, maybe 7 men, heavily armed. One matched the description of those city men. Asking questions earlier this week. Maggie and Grayson exchanged glances. How long ago? The sheriff asked. About an hour. They were moving deliberately, checking landmarks against some kind of map. Jacob shook his head. Didn't like the look of them one bit. Maggie felt the knife in her pocket, her fingers closing around it as her mind raced through the implications. If these men were who she suspected, bandits with fewer scruples than ambition, their interest in her property represented a threat she had prepared for but hoped never to face. I should get back to the homestead, she said quietly. Grayson placed a hand on her shoulder. I'll ride out with you, Maggie. If these men are trouble, you shouldn't be alone. And I'll gather some of the neighbors, Jacob added. We've all benefited from your help strengthening our properties. None of us want to see outsiders causing problems. Maggie looked between them, touched by their concern, but already formulating her own plans. The elaborate trap systems that protected her homestead weren't just designed for hunting game. They had defensive capabilities that neither Grayson, Jacob, nor anyone else in Coopersville fully understood. Thank you both, she said, her voice steady, but let's not overreact. They may simply be passing through. Even as she spoke the words, Maggie knew better. The quiet life she had built since Daniel's death was about to be disrupted. If these men wanted her property, they would discover that Margaret Thorne was prepared to protect what was hers, and that the gentle widow they perceived was merely the surface of much deeper waters. The ride back from Coopersville was tense, with Sheriff Grayson flanking Maggie's wagon, despite her insistence that she would be fine alone. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising an early autumn storm that would reach the valley by nightfall. At least let me escort you to your door, Grayson persisted as they approached the distinctive split-rail fence that marked the boundary of Thorne property. Daniel would never forgive me if I left you to face trouble alone. At the mention of her husband, Maggie's expression softened momentarily. Daniel also knew I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself. She reached beneath the wagon seat and pulled out a Winchester rifle that Grayson hadn't noticed was there. I'm never unprepared, Sheriff. Grayson's eyebrows rose, but he nodded slowly. All right, but promise you'll fire 3 shots if there's any sign of trouble. I'll have men patrolling the valley roads tonight. And we'll come running, Maggie promised, though they both knew her homestead was vast enough that gunshots might not carry to the main road, especially with a storm brewing. As the sheriff turned his horse back toward town, Maggie continued up the long drive to her cabin, her mind already turning over contingency plans. The first fat raindrops began to fall as she stored the wagon and settled Cooper in the stable. Instead of immediately heading to the house as she normally would, Maggie walked purposefully toward a small root cellar about 40 yards behind the main cabin, a structure most visitors assumed was just another storage space for preserves and root vegetables. Maggie unlocked the heavy door with a key she wore on a leather cord around her neck, slipping inside and closing it firmly behind her. She lit a lantern, illuminating a space that bore no resemblance to a typical root cellar. The walls were lined with technical drawings, detailed schematics of trap mechanisms, trigger systems, and defensive layouts. A large workbench dominated The center of the room, covered with tools and materials weighted down by a carved wooden fox, Daniel's gift on their 15th anniversary. This was Maggie's sanctuary, the place where Margaret Walsh Thorne, the master trapper, superseded. Maggie Thorne, the rancher's widow. Here, surrounded by the tools of her former profession, she allowed herself to fully inhabit the identity she kept carefully concealed from most of Coopersville. Maggie moved to a large trunk in the corner, unlocking it to reveal row upon row of journals, 20 years of trapping notes, calculations, and designs. She pulled out a leather-bound volume marked Defensive Configurations 1872 and carried it to the workbench. "Never thought I'd need to reference these again," she murmured to herself, flipping through pages of intricate drawings and annotations. The designs detailed how natural terrain features could be modified for protection, deadfall triggers hidden in rock formations, pit traps disguised as ordinary ground, tripwires that could release a variety of consequences from simple alarms, to devastating snares. The concepts had originated during a job in Montana Territory, where a mining outpost had hired her to design protective measures against claim jumpers and hostile raids. Those same principles had been incorporated throughout Thorne property, though on a much grander scale. The entire valley property was marked with trigger points, hidden mechanisms, and defensive zones that could transform peaceful trails into deadly obstacles within minutes. Maggie ran her finger along a diagram of the northern approach to the ranch, the direction from which Jacob Foster had spotted the riders. That area contained 3 major defensive zones, each controlled by innocuous-looking natural features: a lightning-struck pine that concealed a master trigger, a cluster of boulders hiding release mechanisms, and a small hunter's blind that housed the primary controls for the entire northern quadrant. Thunder rumbled overhead as Maggie studied the schematics. The system hadn't been fully activated in years, not since they tested it shortly after installation. It was time to ensure everything still functioned as designed. Taking a small notebook and pencil, Maggie blew out the lantern and locked the cellar behind her. Rain was falling steadily now, creating a natural cover for her movements as she headed for the barn. To any observer, she would appear to be performing her usual evening check of the livestock before the storm intensified, a routine task for any rancher. But tonight's inspection had a very different purpose. Inside the barn, Maggie moved past the stalls, where her few horses and milk cows rested comfortably. At the far end, behind a false wall in the tack room, lay a series of levers connected to underground tripwires, capable of activating snares and deadfalls across specific sections of the property with a single pull. "Still in working order," she muttered with satisfaction, closing the hidden panel and continuing her inspection route. The mechanisms were stiff from disuse but functional, exactly what she needed to know. For the next hour, as the storm intensified outside, Maggie methodically checked each component of her defensive system, making notes of minor repairs needed, and adjusting mechanisms that had grown rusty with time. By the time full darkness had fallen, accompanied by the steady drumming of rain on the barn roof, she was confident the system could be activated when necessary. A sudden noise cut through the storm's rhythm, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses approaching, moving too deliberately for casual travelers caught in bad weather. Maggie extinguished her lantern immediately, moving to a small window set high in the barn wall. Through the rain-blurred glass, she could make out 5 riders approaching from the northern trail, moving slowly but purposefully toward the main buildings of her homestead. Their formation was telling. Not the casual grouping of friendly visitors, but the deliberate spacing of men expecting trouble. In the brief flashes of lightning, Maggie caught the glint of metal, rifles prominently displayed despite the rain. These were the men Jacob had warned about, arriving earlier than expected, likely driven to seek shelter from the worsening storm. The timing worked both for and against her. The darkness and rain provided cover, but also made it more difficult to implement her defensive strategy with precision. Maggie moved swiftly to the tackroom panel, making several careful adjustments to the primary warning system. This wasn't yet the moment for deadly consequences, but she needed to understand their intentions before determining her response. With practiced efficiency, she activated the perimeter alarms, subtle tripwires that would signal specific intrusion points without immediately alerting the intruders that they had been detected. Then, keeping to the shadows, she made her way to the small side door of the barn, slipping out into the rain and moving quickly toward a dense stand of pine trees that offered a better vantage point. The cold rain soaked through her clothing immediately, but Maggie barely noticed, her focus entirely on the approaching riders. They had stopped at the edge of the cleared area surrounding the cabin and barn, conferring briefly before splitting into two groups. 3 men dismounted and approached the cabin, while 2 others headed toward the barn, a coordinated search pattern that confirmed these were no ordinary visitors. From her concealed position, Maggie could now see the leader clearly, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his cheek, matching Harriet Miller's description perfectly. He directed the others with the confident gestures of someone accustomed to command, pointing toward specific approaches to the cabin that suggested professional assessment rather than casual curiosity. The 2 men approaching the barn moved with similar purpose, one covering the main entrance while the other circled toward the side door she had just used. Their movements were too practiced for simple cattle thieves. These were experienced raiders who had done this many times before. Maggie retreated deeper into the pine stand, moving silently despite the underbrush. Years of trapping had taught her to move through wilderness without leaving signs, a skill that served her well now as she positioned herself to observe without being detected. The men searching the cabin soon emerged, shaking their heads toward their leader. The house was empty as expected at this hour, when most would be finishing evening chores. The scarred man gestured toward the barn, clearly making it their next target. As the 5 raiders converged on the barn, Maggie made her decision. This was clearly no random visit or simple theft attempt. The coordinated search, the heavily armed men, the deliberate timing during a storm when neighbors would be unlikely to notice unusual activity, all pointed to something more sinister than opportunistic rustling. Moving swiftly through the trees, Maggie circled around to the lightning-struck pine that controlled the northern defensive zone. Using Daniel's knife, she carefully exposed the hidden compartment and made a series of precise adjustments to the mechanisms inside. She wasn't activating the deadlier aspects of the system yet, just preparing them for rapid deployment if needed. By the time she had finished, the men had thoroughly searched the barn and regrouped near their horses, frustration evident even through the curtain of rain. The leader appeared to be giving new instructions, pointing toward outbuildings and the surrounding property line. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, just as one man pulled something from his saddlebag. The distinctive shape of a kerosene bottle, unmistakable even at this distance. The implications were clear and chilling. They intended to burn her out. The revelation crystallized Maggie's response. These weren't mere thieves looking for quick profit. They were here to destroy her homestead entirely. Why remained unclear. Whether personal vendetta, land grab, or simply ruthless elimination of witnesses didn't matter in this moment. What mattered was that the home she and Daniel had built together, the legacy she had protected these 4 long years, was facing existential threat. Maggie moved decisively now, no longer concerned with remaining completely undetected. Speed was more critical than absolute stealth. She made her way to the hunter's blind that housed the master controls for the northern sector, slipping inside the small structure just as the raiders began to spread out across the property, kerosene bottles in hand. Inside the blind, protected from the rain at last, Maggie quickly assessed the control panel Daniel had built to her specifications years ago. A series of levers, each connected to different defensive zones, waited for her command. Unlike the warning systems she had activated earlier, these would trigger direct consequences for intruders, consequences designed to incapacitate or drive away threats through escalating levels of severity. Through the blind's narrow viewing slot, Maggie watched as two men approached the barn again, kerosene bottles now uncapped. Her decision was made in an instant. She pulled the first lever, activating the mildest response in her arsenal, the warning system. The effect was immediate and startling. Throughout the clearing, small tripwires triggered a series of mechanical alarms, clattering can and string, arrangements that shattered the storm's rhythm with discordant noise. The raiders froze, clearly startled by the sudden cacophony erupting around them. Their confusion was precisely what Maggie had intended, not to harm them yet, but to disrupt their plan and make them aware they were not dealing with an ordinary, defenseless homestead. The scarred leader recovered quickly, barking orders that sent his men into defensive positions, weapons raised against an enemy they couldn't see. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, Maggie saw the leader gesture angrily toward the barn. Two men rushed forward, determination replacing their momentary hesitation. They would not be deterred by simple noise. If anything, the alarms had only convinced them to act more quickly before the homestead's owner could return. As they reached the barn door, kerosene bottles ready, Maggie pulled the second lever, the one that would demonstrate more forcefully that her property defended itself. The ground before the barn, seemingly solid moments before, suddenly gave way beneath the would-be arsonists. A concealed pit trap, its covering designed to collapse under the weight of adult men, opened beneath them with mechanical precision. The raiders dropped with startled shouts, falling into a pit deep enough to trap but not to seriously injure. At least not from the fall itself. What waited at the bottom was another matter. Years ago, Daniel had lined these defensive pits with a mixture of pine tar and skunk cabbage, a combination that released an overpowering stench when disturbed. The shouts of alarm quickly transformed into retching and cursing as the noxious odor enveloped the trapped men. The leader and his remaining men rushed toward the pit, only to halt abruptly as more ground gave way before them, creating a barrier of unstable terrain between them and their trapped companions. They had unwittingly entered the second defensive zone, where the seemingly solid earth concealed a network of smaller traps designed not to capture, but to create impassable obstacles. Through the viewing slot, Maggie allowed herself a grim smile. As the raiders' coordinated assault dissolved into chaos, they had come prepared to terrorize what they assumed was a vulnerable widow. Instead, they had walked into the carefully orchestrated defenses of Margaret Walsh Thorne, master trapper and survivor. But she harbored no illusions that this first demonstration would drive them away permanently. Men like these, accustomed to violence and theft, would not be deterred by initial failure. If anything, their humiliation would fuel greater determination and cruelty when they returned. And they would return. Of that, Maggie had no doubt. This was merely the opening move in what promised to be a deadly game. With that sobering thought, she checked the remaining defensive levers, ensuring each was primed for activation, if needed. The storm continued to rage outside, providing cover for both her and the retreating raiders as they dragged their companions from the pit and withdrew into the darkness, leaving behind their kerosene bottles and any pretense of legitimate business. Maggie remained in the blind until she was certain they had fully retreated, then made her way cautiously back to the cabin. There was much to prepare before their inevitable return. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a landscape transformed by mud and scattered debris. Maggie had spent the night alternating between reinforcing her defenses and watching from carefully chosen vantage points. Sleep had been impossible. The raiders might have retreated, but she doubted they had gone far. She was in the kitchen brewing coffee when Caleb Foster arrived, his mare splashing through puddles as he rode into the yard with unusual haste. His face registered shock when he saw the scene around the barn. The collapsed pit trap still gaping open, the scattered kerosene bottles, and the churned earth bearing witness to the night's confrontation. "Mrs. Thorne," he called out, dismounting. Before his horse had fully stopped, "What happened here?" Maggie met him on the porch, passing him a steaming mug. "We had visitors last night, not the friendly kind." As they sat on the porch steps, Maggie gave him a measured account of the events, revealing enough to explain the property's condition without exposing the full extent of her defensive systems or her own expertise. The boy's eyes widened with each detail, a mixture of alarm and youthful excitement in his expression. "We should get Parr and the others," he said immediately. "Form a protective group. Those men could come back." "They will come back," Maggie corrected him quietly, "and they'll come with more men and a better plan. Last night was just a scouting party." Caleb studied her face, clearly surprised by her calm certainty. "How can you be so sure?" Maggie took a sip of her coffee, considering how much to reveal. "Because I've seen their type before. They didn't come all this way just to burn one widow's barn and steal a few cattle. They're after something more." She paused, watching understanding dawn in the boy's eyes. "They want the entire valley." It wasn't mere speculation. During the night, as she'd examined the kerosene bottles the raiders had abandoned, Maggie had discovered something telling, a creased and mud-splattered map that had fallen from one of their pockets. The map showed Willow Creek Valley, with several properties marked, including hers, the Fosters, and 3 other prosperous homesteads. Penciled notations in the margins suggested a systematic plan to clear these specific properties within a 2-week time frame. "I need you to take a message to your father," Maggie continued, "and then to Sheriff Grayson. Tell them what happened here last night, but also tell them I believe the Blackwell Ranch may be their next target." "The Blackwells?" Caleb looked confused. "Why them?" "Their property controls the southern pass into the valley," Maggie explained. "If these men are planning what I think they are, they'll want to control all access points. The Blackwells would be the logical next step." As Caleb mounted his horse to deliver her messages, Maggie added a final instruction. "Tell your father to gather the neighbors at the Foster place tonight, 7 o'clock. We need to plan together." After the boy departed, Maggie turned her attention to repairing and resetting the triggered traps from the previous night. The work was physically demanding, digging out collapsed pits, replacing tripwires, and recalibrating trigger mechanisms. But the exertion helped focus her thoughts. By midday, she had restored most of the defensive systems and was reinforcing the barn doors when she heard a horse approaching. She retrieved her rifle from where it leaned against the wall, but relaxed when she recognized Sheriff Grayson's distinctive bay gelding. "Got Caleb's message," Grayson called as he dismounted. "Sounds like you had an eventful night." Maggie led him around the property, showing him the evidence of the attempted arson and the defensive measures that had thwarted it. The sheriff examined the collapsed pit traps with professional interest, whistling softly at their clever construction. "Never would have seen these if they hadn't been triggered," he admitted, kneeling to inspect the mechanism that had released the covering. "How'd you come up with something like this, Maggie?" She shrugged, keeping her tone casual. "Daniel was always concerned about rustlers. We designed a few surprises together over the years. It wasn't a complete lie. Daniel had indeed been involved in implementing the systems, but Grayson clearly sensed there was more to the story." He studied her face for a moment before changing the subject. "I rode by the Blackwell place on my way here," he said. "No sign of trouble yet, but I warned them to stay alert. You really think they'll be targeted next?" Maggie nodded, leading him toward the cabin. "Come inside. There's something you should see." At her kitchen table, she unfolded the map she'd recovered, pointing out the marked properties and the notations regarding timing. Grayson's expression darkened as he studied. This is organized, he muttered. Not just random outlaws looking for easy pickings. Exactly. Someone wants specific properties cleared within a specific time frame. Maggie tapped the corner of the map where a partial letterhead was visible. See this? It's torn, but I recognize the design. It's from the Eastern Colorado Land and Rail Development Company. Grayson looked up sharply. The railroad. You think they're behind this? Not officially, perhaps, but frontier development companies often hire men to clear obstacles to their planned routes. She traced a line across the map with her finger. Willow Creek Valley would provide the most direct route connecting the Eastern Rail Junction to the new mining operations in the Western Mountains. Our properties stand in their way. The sheriff leaned back, absorbing the implications. That would explain why they targeted your barn first, rather than your house. They're not just looking to rob you. They want to destroy your livelihood so you'll be forced to sell. And they'll use the same approach on every marked property, Maggie concluded. Systematic intimidation disguised as random outlaw violence. They spent the next hour developing a plan to protect the valley's homesteads. Grayson would organize regular patrols and position deputies at strategic locations, while Maggie agreed to share her defensive expertise with neighboring families at the meeting that evening. Just one thing puzzles me, Grayson said as he prepared to leave. Why start with your place? The Blackwells have more cattle, the Hendersons have more land, and the Millers are closer to town. Why target you first? Maggie had wondered the same thing, but the answer had come to her during her night watch. Because I'm a widow, she said simply. They assumed I'd be the easiest target, the most likely to flee after a single frightening incident. They didn't expect resistance, Grayson nodded slowly. Their mistake. One they won't make again, Maggie replied. Next time they'll come prepared for a fight. After the sheriff departed, Maggie spent the afternoon making additional preparations. She packed essential supplies into saddlebags that could be quickly grabbed in an emergency. She moved her most valuable possessions and documents to a hidden cache in the root cellar. Most importantly, she reviewed her most advanced defensive designs, concepts she had developed for military outposts that she had never implemented on her own property because of their lethal potential. The situation had escalated beyond simple property protection. If the raiders returned as she expected, with greater numbers and more destructive intent, non-lethal deterrence might not be sufficient. The choice weighed heavily on her as she rode toward the Foster homestead for the evening meeting. The gathering included representatives from all 5 marked properties, along with several neighboring families concerned about the spreading threat. Jacob Foster's main room was crowded with grim-faced men and resolute women, as Maggie explained what she had discovered and demonstrated basic defensive measures they could implement immediately. The most important thing is to establish warning systems, she explained, showing them simple tripwire configurations that could alert homesteaders to approaching intruders. You need time to respond, especially at night. Samuel Blackwell, a gruff man with a snow-white beard who rarely participated in community gatherings, surprised everyone by speaking up. These are good ideas for warnings, Mrs. Thorne, but what do we do when they actually attack? These men sound professional and determined. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Maggie. The question cut to the heart of the dilemma facing these peaceful homesteaders. How far were they willing to go to defend their land? There are 3 levels of defense, Maggie answered carefully. Warning, deterrence, and consequence. She proceeded to outline practical measures for each level, from the simple alarm systems to more elaborate deterrents like the pit traps that had protected her barn. When she reached the 3rd level, she hesitated, aware that she was crossing a threshold in revealing her specialized knowledge. Some threats can only be stopped with more decisive measures, she said finally, her voice steady. I can show you how to create defensive systems that will ensure raiders think twice before targeting your homes." Her deliberately vague phrasing allowed each listener to interpret decisive measures according to their own moral boundaries. But the implication was clear. They were discussing not just scaring away intruders, but potentially injuring or killing them. The conversation that followed revealed the community's deep divisions on the issue. Some, like Blackwell, advocated for aggressive defense of their properties by any means necessary. Others, particularly those with young children, expressed concern about escalating violence. Elizabeth Henderson, whose husband had been killed by raiders in Kansas before they relocated to Colorado, cut through the debate with quiet authority. "There's a difference between seeking violence and being prepared to protect your family when violence finds you," she said. "I, for one, would rather have Mrs. Thorne's knowledge and not need it than need it and not have it." Her words shifted the room's mood. By evening's end, all 5 targeted families had agreed to implement Maggie's defensive recommendations and to establish a communication network using rifle shots and mirror signals to alert each other to danger. As the meeting dispersed, Sheriff Grayson pulled Maggie aside. "I've known you for 4 years, Maggie, but I feel like I'm just now meeting you," he said quietly. "Those weren't just Daniel's designs you showed tonight, were they?" Maggie met his gaze steadily. "Daniel built them, but the designs were mine. Before I came here, before I met him, I had another life." "As what exactly?" "Does it matter now?" she countered. Grayson considered this, then shook his head. "I suppose it doesn't. What matters is that these people need your skills. Whatever their origin." He paused. "Just be careful, Maggie. When word spreads about last night's failed raid, those men will know they're facing someone with unusual knowledge. They might decide to make an example of you." "I'm counting on it," Maggie replied, her voice hardening. "I'd rather they focus on me than families with children." The sheriff studied her face for a moment. "You're setting yourself up as bait." It wasn't a question, but Maggie nodded anyway. "My property is already prepared. The others need time to implement their defenses. If I can draw the raiders' attention for even a few days, it gives the valley a better chance." Grayson's expression showed both admiration and concern. "I'll increase patrols near your place. And Maggie," he hesitated, "don't take unnecessary risks. Daniel wouldn't want you sacrificing yourself, even for the valley." The mention of her husband sent a familiar pang through her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't plan on sacrificing anything, Sheriff. I plan on winning." Be cool. Ride home was tense, with Maggie taking a circuitous route and stopping frequently to check for signs of pursuit. The night remained quiet, however, with only the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. She reached her property shortly after midnight, immediately noticing something wrong. The barn door stood partially open, though she was certain she had secured it before leaving. Moving silently, rifle ready, Maggie circled the structure and approached from the rear entrance. Inside, a single lantern burned low, illuminating a scene that stopped her cold. The barn's interior had been systematically vandalized, hay scattered, tack slashed, and tool handles broken. Cooper and the other animals were unharmed, but clearly agitated in their stalls. But what chilled Maggie's blood was the message, knife carved, into the central support beam. "Next time you burn with it." The raiders had returned during the community meeting, bypassing her outer defensive systems to deliver their warning. They had deliberately avoided causing serious damage or stealing anything valuable. This was purely intimidation, a message that they could reach her whenever they chose. Maggie extinguished the lantern and backed out of the barn, every sense alert for ambush. They might still be watching, waiting to see her reaction to their message. She forced herself to move naturally, as though conducting a routine night check, while her mind raced through the implications. They had found a blind spot in her defenses, likely the southern approach, where she had delayed repairs to focus on the more vulnerable northern zones. More concerning, they had recognized her property's defensive nature and adapted their strategy accordingly. Rather than direct confrontation, they had opted for psychological warfare, demonstrating their ability to penetrate her sanctuary with impunity. Back in the cabin, doors securely barred, Maggie spread her property maps across the kitchen table and began systematically identifying and reinforcing every potential access point. If they had found one weakness, they would exploit it again, next time with more destructive intent. Dawn was breaking when she finally completed her revised defensive plan. The strategy was both simpler and more extreme than her previous approach. Rather than trying to maintain comprehensive coverage across 500 acres, she would create a fortified core around the main buildings and deliberately leave tempting gaps in the outer perimeter. These apparent weaknesses would actually be funnels, channeling intruders into killing zones where her most effective defensive measures could be concentrated. It was a hunter's approach to defense, using the prey's own movements against them, and it required accepting that non-lethal deterrents were no longer sufficient. As she gathered the materials needed to implement her new strategy, Maggie paused before Daniel's photograph on the mantel. "I hope you'd understand what I'm about to do," she whispered to the silent image. "These men have left me no choice." The quiet that followed felt like tacit permission. Daniel had always supported her decisions, trusted her judgment, even when her methods diverged from conventional approaches. He had loved her not despite her unusual past, but because of the strength and knowledge it had given her. With renewed resolve, Maggie headed out to transform her homestead from a defensive refuge into a predator's hunting ground. The raiders' intimidation tactic had backfired. Instead of frightening her, they had only clarified the nature of the conflict and steeled her determination to end it decisively. By sunset, the first phase of her new defenses was in place. Maggie stood on her porch, watching the lengthening shadows with the predator's patience. Let them come now. The hunters were about to discover what it meant to become the hunted. 2 days passed with an unnatural quiet that only heightened Maggie's tension. No riders approached her property, no neighbors reported suspicious activities, and even Sheriff Grayson's patrols encountered nothing unusual. The stillness felt deliberate, a calculated pause designed to fray nerves and lower guards. Maggie used the time to perfect her new defensive strategy. Unlike her previous system, which spread protective measures across the entire property, this approach concentrated lethal force in specific zones while leaving tempting, seemingly undefended corridors as bait. Each morning she worked in plain sight, ostentatiously repairing the triggered pit traps near the barn, making sure any watching eyes would notice her focus on those particular defenses. Meanwhile, in less visible areas, she implemented the military-grade systems she had designed but never before deployed on her own land. The eastern ridge, which appeared to offer concealed approach to the homestead, now concealed a sequence of deadfalls designed to disable rather than merely deter. The shallow creek bed leading from the south, the likely entry point for the barn vandals, now housed a series of spring-loaded spikes beneath innocent-looking crossing points. Most significant was the barn itself. After the raiders' threatening message, Maggie had recognized the structure would be their primary target in any return attack. Rather than merely fortifying it, she transformed it into the centerpiece of her strategy. "They want to burn it," she murmured to herself as she worked, "so I'll give them the opportunity on my terms." By the afternoon of the third day, Caleb Foster arrived with news that shattered the uneasy calm. His normally cheerful face was drawn with tension as he dismounted. "The Blackwells," he said without preamble. "Their entire western pasture fence was cut overnight, half their cattle scattered into the hills." Maggie's expression remained composed, though her mind immediately processed the tactical implications. "Any direct confrontation?" Caleb shook his head. "No. Mr. Blackwell said it was done silently, professionally. They didn't even know until morning roundup." He hesitated. "There's more. The Miller place found all their horses gone this morning, and someone shot at Mr. Henderson when he was checking his property line. The pattern was unmistakable. The raiders were systematically targeting the outer properties first, working their way inward in a tightening circle. Each attack was calibrated, significant enough to cause disruption and fear, but avoiding direct confrontation that might unify the community in armed response. "They're testing our defenses," Maggie said, "learning which properties have implemented my recommendations and which haven't. Sheriff Grayson's organizing extra patrols," Caleb reported. "He's asked if you'd come to town for safety. Says your place is too isolated." Maggie smiled thinly. "That's exactly what they want, to drive us from our homes one by one." She shook her head. "Tell the sheriff I appreciate his concern, but I'm staying. And tell your father to keep extra watch tonight. If they're working inward, the Foster place might be next." After Caleb departed, Maggie made her final preparations. She moved Cooper and her other livestock to a hidden valley on the far western edge of her property, ensuring they wouldn't be harmed in the coming confrontation. Essential documents and irreplaceable mementos joined her previous cache in the root cellar. Finally, she loaded every firearm in the house and positioned them at strategic points throughout the cabin and barn. As dusk approached, Maggie walked her property one last time, checking each trigger and tripwire. The evening breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke, and something else that made her pause. A faint hint of tobacco and horse sweat carried from the direction of the eastern ridge. They were already here, watching and waiting for darkness. Rather than retreating to the cabin, Maggie deliberately entered the barn, making a show of securing the doors and lighting a lantern visible through the windows. She moved about inside for nearly half an hour, creating the impression of evening chores and preparation for night. Then, extinguishing all but one small light, she slipped out through a concealed trapdoor that led to an underground passage, another of Daniel's additions that had seemed excessive until now. The narrow tunnel, shored up with timber supports, every few feet, extended 30 yards from the barn to a dense thicket of wild roses that provided perfect concealment for its exit. Emerging carefully, Maggie made her way to a hunting blind positioned on a small rise overlooking the barn and cabin. From here, she could monitor all approaches to the main buildings while remaining hidden from view. Full darkness descended, bringing with it a chorus of night insects and the occasional hoot of a hunting owl. Maggie settled into the practiced stillness of a veteran trapper, her breathing shallow, her movements imperceptible. The small lantern continued to burn in the barn window, creating the impression of occupancy. The first sign of movement came shortly after midnight, a brief flash of light quickly extinguished on the eastern ridge, followed by the soft nickering of a horse, quickly hushed. They were moving into position. Through her spyglass, Maggie counted dark figures moving in groups of 2 and 3 along the approaches to her property. At least a dozen men, far more than the original raid party, converged from multiple directions in a coordinated pattern that confirmed her assessment. These were not opportunistic bandits, but organized operators executing a planned assault. Their approach revealed they had indeed been watching her activities. They avoided the areas where she had ostentatiously repaired defenses near the barn, instead following the paths she had deliberately left appearing unguarded. The largest group, led by a tall figure Maggie recognized as the scarred leader from the first attempt, moved cautiously along the creek bed from the south, exactly where she had anticipated. Maggie remained motionless, watching as the men reached. the first of her new defensive positions. A lead raider, moving confidently through what seemed an undefended approach, suddenly pitched forward with a muffled cry as his foot triggered a spring-loaded mechanism. The crude but effective device didn't kill. Maggie had deliberately calibrated it to wound rather than slay. But the man's leg was effectively pinned, and his pained gasp alerted his companions to the danger. The raiders froze, suddenly aware. They had walked into carefully prepared ground. Their hesitation was momentary. These were experienced men who had faced danger before. With practiced coordination, they adjusted their approach, using fallen branches to probe the ground ahead for additional traps. Maggie watched impassively as they navigated the first defensive line, their caution slowing, but not stopping there. Advance. This was anticipated. No single layer of defense would halt determined attackers. The true strategy lay in the cumulative effect of multiple defensive zones, each more dangerous than the last, each herding the intruders toward the final confrontation point she had selected. The raiders' progress continued, measured and deliberate. A second man triggered a wire that released a deadfall of heavy logs, narrowly escaping serious injury but further slowing the group's approach. Their frustration was evident in their body language and the increasingly frequent glances toward their leader for direction. The scarred man gestured sharply, sending 3 raiders toward the cabin while directing the main force to continue toward the barn, the primary target where the lantern still burned. Maggie noted with grim satisfaction that they were following the exact path she had prepared, funneling themselves into her final trap. As the main group reached the open area before the barn, they paused for a final conference. Even from her hidden position, Maggie could see the objects they were distributing, kerosene bottles with rag fuses, identical to those from the first raid, but in greater quantity. Their intent was clear. This time they would ensure the barn burned completely. Moment had come. Maggie raised her rifle and fired a single shot into the air, not targeting any raider, but serving as the trigger for the sequence she had prepared. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The single lantern in the barn suddenly extinguished, plunging the area into darkness. Simultaneously, hidden tripwires activated around the perimeter of the clearing, releasing a complicated series of mechanical responses. Weighted ropes dropped from carefully positioned tree branches, log counterweights shifted, and a domino effect of triggers cascaded through her defensive system. Heavy logs previously balanced on the barn roof rolled down, creating a barricade. Across the main doors, just as the raiders approached with their kerosene. At the same time, concealed trapdoors in the ground beneath them dropped open, catching 4 men in well-placed pit traps. Unlike the previous traps designed merely to hold intruders, these were augmented with sharpened stakes that ensured any who fell would not easily rise again. The raiders' coordinated assault dissolved into chaos. Those not caught in traps scattered for cover, firing wildly into the darkness at an enemy they couldn't locate. Their shots went wide, hitting nothing but air and timber as they struggled to understand the nature of the attack against them. In the confusion, none noticed the thin streams of liquid seeping from beneath the barn doors, coal oil that Maggie had strategically placed to turn their own tactics against them. When one panicked raider fired toward the barn, the muzzle flash ignited the flammable liquid. Fire raced along the ground in controlled channels, following paths Maggie had prepared to divide the clearing into sections while leaving escape routes deliberately clear. The flames illuminated the scene in flickering orange light, revealing the full extent of the trap. Raiders caught in pit traps called desperately for help. Others fired uselessly at mechanical triggers they mistook for human attackers, and their leader shouted contradictory orders that went unheeded in the chaos. From her hidden position, Maggie methodically targeted the mounted raiders who had remained at the perimeter as lookouts. Her first shot struck the rifle of a man, raising it toward the cabin, shattering the weapon and sending splinters into his face. Her second disabled a horse without harming its rider. Her third shattered a lantern about to be lit as an incendiary. Each shot was precisely aimed to disable rather than kill, legal defense rather than vengeance, but each demonstrated a level of marksmanship that sent an unmistakable message. She could have taken lethal shots had she chosen to. The scarred leader, recognizing the tactical disaster unfolding around him, bellowed retreat orders. Those raiders, still able to move, helped their wounded to horses, abandoning equipment and weapons in their haste to escape the killing ground the clearing had become. As they fled in disarray, Maggie triggered her final defensive measure. The eastern ridge, which offered the most direct retreat path, suddenly erupted with noise as hidden noisemakers, tin cans filled with pebbles attached to tripwires, created an auditory barrier that sent the fleeing men veering south instead, directly toward the waiting Sheriff Grayson and his deputies. The lawmen had been positioned at Maggie's suggestion, not directly on her property, where they might have been detected, but along the likely escape route. The sound of distant gunfire and shouted orders confirmed they had intercepted at least some of the retreating raiders. Maggie remained in her blind until certain no threats remained near the homestead. The controlled fire lines had burned themselves out as designed, leaving the barn untouched while creating a perimeter of scorched earth that ironically would serve as a firebreak against any future arson attempts. Dawn was breaking as she finally emerged, rifles still ready as she approached the clearing. 3 raiders remained trapped in her pits, their injuries painful but not life-threatening. Another lay unconscious near the barn, struck by a falling log during the chaotic retreat. "Mrs. Thorne!" Sheriff Grayson's voice called from the property line. He approached cautiously, leading a small posse that included Jacob Foster and Samuel Blackwell. Their expressions as they surveyed the battlefield, for that was what her homestead had become, mixed shock, admiration, and a new wariness as they looked at the widow who had engineered such a devastating defense. "We captured 6 fleeing this direction," Grayson reported, his eyes moving from the trapped raiders to the strategic placement of defensive mechanisms around the clearing, including their leader, the one with the scar. "Any of our people hurt?" Maggie asked, her voice steady despite the exhaustion beginning to seep through her body now that the danger had passed. "Not a scratch," the sheriff replied. "They were too busy running to put up much fight when they hit our line." He paused, studying her face. "Maggie, what happened here wasn't just clever traps. This was military-grade defensive strategy." She met his gaze without flinching. "Before I was Daniel's wife, before I was Margaret Thorne, I was Margaret Walsh. I designed defensive systems for the army during the Sioux campaigns. Outposts under threat of raid needed more than walls and rifles." She gestured toward the barn, still standing intact despite being the raiders' primary target. "I never wanted to use those skills again, but these men gave me no choice." Grayson absorbed this revelation, nodding slowly. The Army's loss was Willow Creek Valley's gain, it seems. He gestured toward his deputies who began securing the captured raiders. "We found papers on their leader. You were right about the railroad connection. He's a hired enforcer for Eastern Colorado Land and Rail, has a reputation for clearing properties that stand in the way of planned routes." "Will it be enough to prosecute the company?" Maggie asked. The sheriff shook his head. "They'll deny any knowledge, claim he was acting independently, but it'll be enough to hang him and his men for attempted murder and arson." He looked around at the meticulously designed defensive setup. "Though I'm not sure how to explain all this in my report." "Just say I was prepared," Maggie replied simply. "The details aren't important." As the posse secured the prisoners and tended to their injuries, Jacob Foster approached Maggie, his expression troubled. "If they targeted you first, because you're a widow, thinking you'd be easily frightened off, they made about the biggest mistake possible, didn't they?" Maggie allowed herself a small smile, the first since the ordeal began. People often mistake being alone for being vulnerable. I may be a widow, but I'm far from defenseless. By mid-morning, riders from throughout the valley had gathered at the Thorne homestead, drawn by news of the night's dramatic events. They came to offer help repairing the minimal damage, to see firsthand the defensive systems that had repelled hardened raiders, and most importantly, to acknowledge that the quiet widow they had pitied had become the community's unexpected protector. Samuel Blackwell, who had lost cattle in the raiders' earlier attack, summed up the valley's shifting perception as he stood surveying the mechanical traps Maggie had designed. "My father always said you should never judge a book by its cover," the gruff rancher observed. "Reckon that goes double for widows who used to design defenses for the U.S. Army." As the neighbors worked together to reset traps and repair triggered mechanisms, Maggie allowed herself to fully inhabit, for the first time since Daniel's death, both sides of her identity, the skilled homesteader and the master defensive strategist. The need for concealment had passed, replaced by open acknowledgement of her capabilities and their value to the community she had chosen as home. The barn, which the raiders had twice targeted for destruction, stood as testament to her successful defense, not just of timber and tools, but of the life and legacy she had built with Daniel. It had been transformed from vulnerability to victory, from target to trophy. By sunset, with the homestead restored and the neighbors departed, Maggie stood alone on her porch, watching the lengthening shadows. The immediate threat had been neutralized, the raiders captured, the valley secured, yet she knew the larger forces behind the attack, the railroad's expansion plans, and the financial interests they represented, would not be so easily defeated. This battle was won, but she suspected the war for Willow Creek Valley had only just begun. Whatever came next, however, would face not a scattered collection of isolated homesteaders, but a unified community that now recognized the strength that lay in unexpected places, particularly in the hands of a widow who had transformed her entire valley into a defensive masterpiece. A cold wind swept across Willow Creek Valley as autumn deepened into early winter. 3 weeks had passed since the decisive battle at the Thorne homestead, and an uneasy peace had settled over the community. The captured raiders awaited trial in the territorial prison, their scarred leader reportedly offering testimony against his railroad employers in exchange for leniency, a desperate gambit unlikely to spare him from the gallows. Maggie stood atop the western ridge of her property, surveying the valley below. The landscape had transformed since that fateful night, not just with the turning of seasons, but with the proliferation of defensive measures now visible on neighboring homesteads. Log barricades protected approaches to the Blackwell Ranch. Early warning systems ringed the Foster property, and carefully positioned hunting blinds offered clear fields of fire around the Henderson place. The community had embraced Maggie's defensive philosophy with an enthusiasm that still surprised. What began as necessary protection against immediate threat had evolved into a broader security strategy for the entire valley, one that drew frequent visitors from neighboring communities seeking to implement similar measures on their own properties. "Quite a view," called a voice from behind her. Maggie turned to find Sheriff Grayson approaching on horseback, his breath visible in the chill air. "You can see why the railroad wants this valley so badly from up here." She nodded, gesturing toward the natural corridor that cut through the surrounding hills. Perfect route, connecting eastern territories to the western mining operations. Engineer in me can understand the appeal from a purely technical perspective. This casual reference to her former profession still felt strange. The concealment of her expertise had become so habitual over the years that speaking openly about it remained unfamiliar. Yet the events of recent weeks had made such pretense unnecessary, even counterproductive. "Got news from Denver," Grayson said, dismounting to stand beside her at the overlook. "Territorial Governor's Office is formally investigating Eastern Colorado land and rail. Seems your scarred friend wasn't their only enforcer operating in the territories. Similar incidents reported from 3 other counties. Will anything come of it? Maggie asked, knowing how political interests and economic power typically aligned. Hard to say. Railroad money runs deep, but 16 men facing hanging has created uncomfortable questions even their friends in government can't easily dismiss. Grayson pulled a folded document from his coat. There's more. This arrived by official courier this morning. Maggie unfolded the paper, recognizing the territorial government seal. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the formal language requesting her presence in Denver as an expert witness in the investigation of coordinated intimidation and violence in furtherance of corporate acquisition of privately held lands. They want me to testify about the raiders and their tactics, she said, surprise evident in her voice. Not just that, Grayson corrected. Read the second page. They're specifically interested in your expertise regarding defensive systems for homesteads and settlements. Seems word of your background has reached official channels. Maggie turned to the second page, finding a separate request from the territorial. Militia commander seeking consultation on implementation of protective measures for vulnerable frontier communities based on methods successfully deployed in Willow Creek Valley. How did they learn about me? She wondered aloud. The sheriff looked slightly uncomfortable. Might have mentioned some details in my official report. Felt they needed to understand how one homestead managed to capture 7 armed raiders without casualties on our side. He met her gaze directly. Was that wrong of me? Maggie considered the question seriously. For years, she had deliberately obscured her past, allowing herself to be seen as nothing more than a rancher's widow. The protective anonymity had become a comfortable habit, a shield against unwanted attention and painful memories. Yet recent events had demonstrated that her knowledge could serve a purpose beyond her personal security. No, she decided finally. It wasn't wrong, though I'm not certain I want to become a public figure in territorial politics. Might not have much choice in the matter, Grayson observed. Stories spread. The mysterious widow who single-handedly defeated a gang of railroad enforcers makes for compelling gossip in frontier towns. Some versions have you personally fighting off 20 men in hand-to-hand combat. Despite herself, Maggie smiled. Hardly. Mechanical systems did most of the work. Systems you designed and implemented, the sheriff reminded her. False modesty. Doesn't suit you, Maggie. Before she could respond, the distant sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the main trail. A group of 5 riders approached, led by Caleb Foster with a stranger in an expensive coat beside him. More visitors? Grayson asked, already moving toward his horse. Not expecting any, Maggie replied, her hand instinctively checking the rifle slung across her back. Though the immediate threat had passed, the habits of vigilance remained. They rode down to intercept the approaching party, meeting them at the boundary marker where Willow Creek crossed onto Thorn property. Caleb waved cheerfully, but Maggie's attention focused on the well-dressed stranger, clearly a city man with his tailored clothes and carefully groomed appearance. Mrs. Thorn, Caleb called. This gentleman asked for you specifically, says he's from back east. The stranger removed his hat, revealing prematurely silver hair, framing a youthful face with intelligent eyes. Mrs. Margaret Thorn, or should I say Margaret Walsh. His accent carried the refined tones of formal education and Eastern upbringing. Colonel James Harrington, formerly of the War Department, currently with the Smithsonian Institution. Maggie's expression remained carefully neutral despite her surprise. You're a long way from Washington, Colonel. Indeed, I am. He smiled easily. May we speak privately? I've traveled quite a distance specifically to meet with you. After ensuring Caleb and the Colonel's attendants were comfortably settled at the cabin with coffee, Maggie led Harrington and Sheriff Grayson to her workshop in the converted root cellar. The space had been transformed since the raid. No longer A hidden sanctuary, but an open working area where she now freely displayed her designs and technical drawings. "Remarkable," Harrington murmured, examining the schematics covering one wall. "These defensive configurations are even more sophisticated than the reports suggested." "What reports would those be, Colonel?" Maggie asked directly. "And what exactly brings a Smithsonian representative to my door?" Harrington turned from the drawings, his expression becoming more formal. "Mrs. Thorne, your reputation preceded you long before recent events. Your work designing defensive systems during the Sioux campaigns was extensively documented in military archives. Quite revolutionary for its time, particularly coming from a woman engineer when such was virtually unheard of." "That was another lifetime," Maggie said carefully. "I left that work behind deliberately. So we discovered, when attempting to locate you 5 years ago, Margaret Walsh simply vanished from official records." He gestured around the workshop. "Yet here you are, implementing the same principles, evolved and refined, to protect civilian settlements rather than military outposts." Sheriff Grayson shifted uncomfortably. "You still haven't explained your purpose here, Colonel." Harrington nodded. "Direct, then. The federal government is establishing a Bureau of Territorial Development, specifically focused on secure settlement of frontier regions. Recent railroad expansion has created conflicts similar to what you experienced here. We need someone with both technical expertise in defensive systems and practical experience implementing them in civilian contexts." "You're offering me a position," Maggie stated flatly, understanding dawning. "A directorship, actually, based initially in Denver, then Washington when the Bureau is fully established. Full authority to develop protection standards for frontier settlements, train implementation teams, and consult on territorial security policy." Harrington placed a formal letter on her workbench. "The President has taken personal interest in this initiative after reports of corporate strong-arm tactics threatening homesteaders across multiple territories." Maggie glanced at the letter without touching it, her mind racing through implications. After years of deliberate obscurity, she was being offered a return to public life, and at a level of authority she had never held, even in her previous career. "I have obligations here," she said finally. "This is my home." We anticipated that response. Harrington smiled slightly. "The position would require occasional travel, but could be structured to allow you to maintain your residence here. In fact, your property could serve as a demonstration site and training facility if you were amenable." Sheriff Grayson cleared his throat. "Seems the Colonel has thought of everything." "Not quite everything," Maggie countered, studying Harrington carefully. "You haven't explained why me, specifically. There must be dozens of military engineers with defensive experience, most with formal credentials I lack." Harrington's expression grew more serious. "Because none of them successfully implemented civilian defensive systems without military resources or personnel. What you accomplished here, transforming ordinary homesteaders into a secure community using locally available materials and practical training, is precisely what frontier settlements need." He gestured toward her drawings. "Your systems don't require soldiers to operate them. They empower civilians to protect themselves." The conversation continued for nearly an hour as Harrington outlined the proposed role in greater detail and answered Maggie's increasingly specific questions. Throughout the discussion, she found her initial reluctance giving way to cautious interest. The position offered more than professional recognition. It provided an opportunity to implement protective measures across vulnerable territories, potentially preventing other communities from facing the violence Willow Creek Valley had endured. "I'll need time to consider," she said finally, as they emerged from the workshop into the afternoon light. "Of course," Harrington agreed. "I'll remain in Coopersville for the week. Take whatever time you require." After the Colonel and his party Departed, escorted by Sheriff Grayson toward town, Maggie retreated to her porch, settling into Daniel's old rocking chair as she contemplated the unexpected offer. The position aligned perfectly with her skills and would allow her to extend the protection she had created here to countless other vulnerable communities. Yet accepting meant stepping fully back into public life, abandoning the quiet anonymity she had cultivated since Daniel's death. It meant acknowledging officially what neighbors now knew privately, that she was far more than a simple rancher's widow. As twilight approached, Maggie noticed riders coming from the direction of the Foster homestead. Sarah Foster led the small group, accompanied by Elizabeth Henderson and 3 other women from neighboring properties. Unlike most visitors who approached with a certain caution, they rode directly to her cabin with the confidence of expected guests. "Right on time," Sarah called as they dismounted. "Brought the militia as promised." Maggie smiled despite her preoccupied thoughts. The militia was Sarah's humorous term for the Women's Mutual Aid Society that had formed in the wake of the raids, a network of homesteaders' wives who had taken particular interest in Maggie's defensive designs and their potential applications in daily protection. "Colonel's gone?" Elizabeth asked, carrying a basket of fresh bread toward the porch. "For now," Maggie confirmed, helping the women unload supplies for what had become a weekly gathering. "Word travels fast. Caleb couldn't wait to spread the news that the famous Mrs. Thorne is being courted by the federal government," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "Boy's been telling anyone who'll listen that you'll soon be advising the president himself." Inside the cabin, the women established themselves around Maggie's kitchen table with practiced efficiency. What had begun as informal visits to check on the widow after the dramatic raid had evolved into a regular planning session for community security measures, specifically focused on protections that could be implemented and maintained by women, while men were working distant fields or away on hunting expeditions. "We've modified the tripwire system for the Miller place," Elizabeth explained, unrolling a rough sketch. "Hannah can trigger it from her kitchen window without having to go outside if strangers approach." Maggie examined the drawing, impressed by the practical adaptation. "You've improved my original design. The counterweight system is more efficient." As the discussion continued, Maggie found herself struck by how thoroughly these women, none with formal technical training, had embraced and expanded upon her defensive concepts. They spoke confidently of pressure triggers, alarm configurations, and strategic placements that would have been completely foreign to them just weeks earlier. "I've been offered a government position," she said suddenly, interrupting a debate about the best placement for warning systems at the Henderson property. "Developing defensive standards for frontier settlements throughout the territories." The women fell silent, exchanging glances before Sarah spoke. "Will you accept?" "I'm uncertain," Maggie admitted. "It would mean dividing my time between here and Denver, eventually Washington." "You should take it," Elizabeth said firmly, surprising Maggie with her certainty. "What you've taught us has transformed how we see our homes, our capabilities. Other communities deserve the same opportunity." "The Colonel mentioned training facilities," Maggie said carefully. "This property would become somewhat official," Sarah laughed, "as opposed to its current status as unofficial pilgrimage site for every curious rancher within 100 miles. Maggie, people already come from 3 counties to see your defensive systems. Might as well make it formal." The conversation shifted to practical considerations of how the valley might accommodate increased visitors, the potential economic benefits for Coopersville, and the logistics of Maggie's occasional absences. Not once did any woman suggest the position might be inappropriate or beyond Maggie's capabilities. Their confidence in her expertise was absolute and unquestioning. As evening deepened, the gathering concluded with plans for their next meeting. The women departed in high spirits, each taking a different route home, in accordance with the security protocols Maggie had established, always varying patterns, always maintaining awareness of surroundings. Alone again, Maggie lit a lantern and approached the mantelpiece where Daniel's photograph stood. 4 years had passed since his death, yet she still found herself consulting his silent image at moments of decision. "They're offering me a return to my old life," she told the photograph softly. "Not exactly as it was, but the work I once did, only with greater purpose and authority than before." She traced the familiar features of his face with her finger. "You never asked me to set aside my expertise when we married. That was my choice, wanting simplicity after years of struggling for recognition in military circles." She smiled slightly at the memory. "You were so proud when I designed our first defensive systems here. Insisted they were too clever to keep to ourselves." The silence of the cabin seemed to hold a quality of expectancy, as though the very walls that had witnessed their life together waited for her decision. "I couldn't protect you from illness," she whispered, "but what we built together here protected this entire valley. Perhaps it's time to extend that protection further, as you always believed we should." The decision crystallized with unexpected clarity. Daniel had never wanted her to diminish herself or hide her capabilities. He had loved both Margaret Walsh, the engineer, and Maggie Thorne, the rancher's wife, seeing them not as separate identities, but as complementary facets of the woman he had chosen to share his life with. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Maggie rode to Coopersville with purpose, Daniel's pocket-knife secure in her coat as a tangible connection to the life they had shared. Colonel Harrington received her decision with professional satisfaction, immediately outlining next steps while assuring her that arrangements would preserve her connection to the valley she called home. Sheriff Grayson, witnessing the formal acceptance, offered his quiet support. "Daniel would be proud," he said simply, as they left the hotel. "Though not surprised. He always said you were meant for more than most folks realized." The weeks that followed brought rapid change to both Maggie's life and Willow Creek Valley. A small office was established in a converted storeroom behind Miller's General Store, staffed by 2 young assistants sent from Denver to document her designs and handle increasing correspondence. The first official training session for territorial rangers drew 20 participants who camped on the western section of Thorne property while learning basic implementation of defensive perimeters. Most significantly, the Women's Militia formalized into an officially recognized Homestead Defense Association, with Sarah Foster elected as president and Maggie serving as technical advisor. Their practical adaptations of her designs, specifically tailored for implementation by women defending isolated homesteads, became a cornerstone of the territorial security recommendations submitted to Denver. On a crisp December morning, 6 weeks after accepting the position, Maggie stood once again on the western ridge overlooking the valley. Fresh snow blanketed the landscape, but clear paths connected each homestead along routes designed for optimal security and mutual support. Regular patrols by community members maintained these lifelines, ensuring no property remained isolated or vulnerable. The barn that raiders had twice targeted for destruction now served as a training center where visitors learned to implement defensive systems on their own properties. The cabin had expanded with a new wing housing drafting tables and meeting space. The hidden workshop in the converted root cellar had transformed into an innovation laboratory where Maggie tested new defensive concepts before recommending them for wider implementation. Most remarkably, the community itself had evolved from scattered, independent homesteaders into an interconnected network of mutual support, not just in security matters, but in all aspects of frontier life. The defensive systems that physically connected Their properties had fostered deeper connections between the families themselves, creating a resilience that no external force could easily overcome. As Maggie surveyed this transformation, she recognized that her acceptance of the government position hadn't required abandoning her life here as she had initially feared. Instead, it had allowed that life to expand, encompassing both her technical expertise and her commitment to the community she called home. The widow who had once concealed her capabilities behind a veil of ordinary grief had emerged as something far more powerful, a woman whose unique skills bridged the gap between government policy and frontier reality, whose painful past had forged the tools needed to secure others' futures. The raiders who had targeted her barn, seeing only a vulnerable widow on isolated land, had indeed made a catastrophic error in judgment. They had attacked not the weakest point in the valley's defenses, but its strongest foundation, a woman whose unassuming appearance concealed the mind of a master strategist and the heart of a community protector. As Maggie turned her horse back toward home, she carried with her the certainty that Daniel would have approved of this new chapter. The defensive systems they had designed together to protect their private sanctuary had become the blueprint for securing communities throughout the territories. The legacy they had built in partnership would continue to save lives long after the raiders who had threatened it were forgotten. The barn still stood at the center of her property, no longer merely a structure to house livestock and equipment, but a symbol of resilience against those who underestimated the quiet strength of frontier women and the communities they helped sustain. The bandits had tried to destroy a widow's barn, never knowing she would transform not just her valley, but the entire approach to frontier security in response. Their greatest mistake had not been targeting her property, but failing to recognize that sometimes the most formidable defenses lie hidden behind the most unassuming facades, particularly when those facades belong to women with the expertise and determination to protect what they value most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.